Good morning and good afternoon. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful program for you today with a panel of world-class experts on the subject of possible economic integration between Russia and Belarus as Moscow seeks to take advantage of the crisis in Belarus. Our panel includes Dr. Katerina Baranukova, the academic director of the Baroque Economic Research Center in Minsk, Dr. Alyaksandr Chubrik, the director of the IPM Institute in Minsk, Professor Vladislav Inozemtsev, Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Ambassador Dirk Schwebel, the Ambassador of the European Union in Belarus, and Dr. Anders Osland, the Senior Fellow at the Eurasia Center, and my colleague. So, the pro-democracy movement in Belarus now faces the difficult prospect of dislodging Mr. Lukashenko, the unrecognized president who refuses to leave office, backed by billions of dollars from Russian firms, and also the support of Vladimir Putin. How will Russian public and private investment affect Belarus's economic outlook in the short and long term? What political effects does Russian financial patronage have on its client countries? What should the EU and the US do? Now, with that as a background, I'll first turn to Dr. Baranukova. Can you please tell us what the most important problems are with the Belarusian economy? Is it economic stagnation, too little currency reserves, or depreciating Belarusian ruble?
Thank you, and it's an honor for me to speak here. If we take a look at Belarusian economic growth over the last 10 years, we will see stagnation. Average growth rate was around 1.7% only, which is too low for a developing economy, which needs to catch up. And the reason for this is structural problems, lack of reforms and privatization. As a result, we have a very large state-owned sector, which is inefficient and which has accumulated a lot of debt. And this debt was slowly transferred to the government, which means that, well, right now, over the years, Belarus has also accumulated public debt. And right now, the debt is up to 35% of GDP. It's not relatively large, but it's quite difficult to serve because the majority of this debt is nominated in foreign currencies. And that means that the liquidity in currency is always a problem for Belarus. And it often turns to Russia to solve this problem. So right now, 50% of the debt is held by Russia or Russia-associated funds. And this is not all about Russia dependency. So around 40% of our exports go to Russia. The large portion of our exports is made from oil imported from Russia. Our energy dependency is huge, etc. And the current political situation has, of course, made all these problems worse. The collapse of trust means that the stagnation might probably turn into long-run recession or near zero growth. It also means that people have lost faith in the banking system. They're withdrawing rubles, their savings in rubles, and convert them into dollars. And it has already cost Belarus 1 billion in its reserves in August. And it also means that right now access to international markets and international financial institutions for funding is closed for Belarus. And for example, next year we will have to pay around 3 billion in debt servicing and repayment. And we only have 7.5 billion of reserves right now, of which only 3 billion are liquid reserves. The rest is illiquid assets or monetary gold. So of course, the liquidity problem is like the urgent problem right now. And the only resource we can turn to without political changes is Russia. So this is all on my side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so Vladislav Inozemtsev, during the meeting in Sochi in September, President Vladimir Putin promised Lukashenko serious help from both public and private sector. What did this assistance amount to, or what would it amount to?
Look, I would agree definitely with Katerina about the dependency which Belarus has vis-a-vis Russia, but I would say, on the other hand, that actually I wouldn't say that Russia is pressuring Belarus through the private enterprise. It's state-to-state relationship, first of all. Belarus definitely has a lot of loans which it got from Russia. It has huge connections between Belarus and Russian state-owned enterprises, like, for example, all the oil supplies, all the gas supplies, they are orchestrated from the Russian side by the state. But at the same time, I would say the state-to-state relationship in economic issues may have quite surprising effect because, for example, even if the government in Belarus changes, Russia will not, it cannot decouple from Belarus because there are a lot of links which tightens two countries. First of all, Belarus is a part of the so-called Union state with Russia, existing from 1999. It's a part of the Eurasian Economic Union. And in this case, Russia cannot allow itself to lose Belarus. It's a huge difference between Belarus and Ukraine, for example, in this case, because Ukraine never was a part of any Russian-led integrationist organizations, but Belarus is. So therefore, I would say that any other government, except of Mr. Lukashenko's, can actually make some profit, some use of this relationship with Russia. It's not about cutting this relationship because, as it was mentioned before, Belarus is very heavily dependent on Russian imports, oil and gas imports, which cannot be substituted very easily. And it supplies, ships around 55-56% of its exports to Russia. So therefore, my point is that in state-to-state relationship, it should be find some new balance, which can be found even without Lukashenko, because Russia, from my point of view, wants to have Belarus on her side, not exactly Mr. Lukashenko, because many people in Moscow are tired of him. And the second point, which I would say, the Russian private investment in Belarus is not very substantial. If I'm not mistaken, it's concentrated in some part of oil processing, in telecommunications and banking business, but nevertheless, the most part of Belarusian economy is state-owned. So therefore, there is no other ways to press Belarus except of this state-to-state relationship. So therefore, it's on the one hand it's bad, on the other hand it's good that the state systems are so much interconnected. So therefore, there are some challenges here, but also some kind of possibilities.
All right, but again, so do you have specific thoughts as to where Russian investment might come in?
Look, this is from my point of view, the Russian investment, if you are talking about private investment, can come
Right.
into different sectors because the Belarusian economy is state-owned and it's definitely undervalued because no one actually knows what the value of Belarusian enterprise might be. So therefore, the Russians are staying on the sidelines, ready to to participate in Belarusian privatization if it will happen. If it happens. So nevertheless, but in any case, once again, the difference between Ukraine, for example, and Belarus is that the Belarusian economy is state-owned. It's not controlled by the oligarchy groups as it was and as it is in Ukraine. So therefore, for participating in this privatization, for getting these shares or stakes in Belarusian enterprise, the Russian private company should be allowed to do so. So therefore, there were several moves from the Russian side, from the Russian private companies, in direction of, somehow changing this situation and to being allowed to jump in. Many of them might be very, enthusiastic about this, but there is no means these days since Lukashenko still is in full control of Belarusian economy.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Shubrik, how would Belarusians look upon private Russian enterprise expansion into the Belarus economy, assuming there is some opening up?
First of all, hello and good morning or good afternoon, Ambassador. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think the Belarusians are in no way negative vis-a-vis Russia, nor vis-a-vis the EU or the West. They are very open to cooperation with whoever is willing to invest or to come to Belarus. Therefore, I think they would be very open to this. I think we have already, maybe we don't have so many investments as was mentioned before, but I think the Belarusian population as such would be very open to do so. And the same goes, of course, for us, for the EU side, and for any other investor. That is something that they all hope for, in fact.
All right. And do you think there's an alternative for closer EU-Belarus cooperation within the European partnership?
Well, first of all, we are not in a competition with Russia, which is sometimes mentioned by the one or the other side. We are not in a zero-sum game with Russia. Russia has the leading role in Belarus. It is the main partner, it's the closest partner, and we do not have any intention to compete with Russia in this context. On the other hand, of course, we have been interested in intensifying our cooperation with Belarus, and we have shown a lot of goodwill in the last 5 years. We have opened a lot of opportunities for Belarus. We have increased our financial cooperation. We have doubled it. We have opened the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and European Investment Bank for the public sector in Belarus. All of we have also helped Belarus in its accession process to the WTO. And of course, we have established a number of dialogues, or we have reopened a number of dialogues that we had in place since 2015, following the last release of political prisoners in 2015. Now, obviously, we are now in a new situation in which we have to reassess our relations. I can tell you at least one positive thing in all the negative news over the past few months. We have just a few weeks ago registered European Belarusian Business Association, which is supposed to help European companies or Western companies, whoever wants to become a member. And of course, it should also help in principle the government and to increase investments, to increase trade. So that is one little glimpse of hope, light at the end of the tunnel, if I may say so.
All right, but the demonstrations which continue, the repression which sadly also continues, is this affecting the EU's approach in this area?
Yes, of course it is affecting. I think you have seen many of our statements. And while we are talking, by the way, our second sanctions package is going to be published right now, on which also Mr. Lukashenko will be posted. Obviously, it shows our dissatisfaction with the developments, in particular since the elections on the 9th of August that took place. We have repeatedly spoken out against the violence that has been applied by the authorities and continues to be applied, which is why we were forced to have a second package. We have right now exactly 100 political prisoners in Belarus that we are counting as EU. That is why also we ask for a repeat election of the flawed election of the 9th of August. This has, of course, an influence on our policy. We are currently reassessing in Brussels, together with our EU member states, the policy to follow with regard to Belarus. And no doubt there will have been restrictions in our policy, but we very much hope that Mr. Lukashenko and the authorities come to reason and will stop the violence, will release the political prisoners, and will agree to repeat elections, and will reach out to the opposition and to civil society to have a true dialogue and not a dialogue in jail, as was started by Mr. Lukashenko some weeks ago.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Dr. Schubrick, I think that the ambassador's comments point to the dilemma, or part of the dilemma, for the Belarusian economy. It's clear that given the instincts of President Lukashenko, economic cooperation with the EU and more broadly with the West is likely to be limited. So that makes Russia the alternative. So how would Belarusians look upon private Russian enterprise expanding into the Belarusian economy?
Well, in fact, hard to say that Belarusians have some special view on expansion of Russian business in Belarus, because as Mr. Nazemtsev mentioned, Belarus and Russia relations are considered to mainly state-to-state relations, although in fact interests of Russian business are quite significant, especially in potash, the biggest Russian interest, but it is not, of course, private, but state is transit, of course. But potash and oil processing and also oil supply to Belarus, telecommunications, so quite many sectors. But here no special objections from the side of Belarusians towards Russian business or whatever else. But I should slightly disagree with the quite a widespread opinion about the Belarusian economy is that majority of Belarusian economy is state-owned. In fact, if you look at the most recent data of 2019, for instance, we can in fact count shares of the employment in the private sector and state-owned commercial enterprises and in budgetary sector, so-called like public sector. And you will see that public sector employs like 25% of total employment. State-owned enterprises like 1/3 of total employment, and the rest, which means that more than 40 or around 45%, is employed by private companies. And this situation was changing very fast during the last 10 years. So private sector was booming and state-owned enterprise was shrinking. In fact, which is quite important for understanding the situation in Belarus. You cannot look at it as like underestimated or undervalued state-owned companies, because we have state-owned companies, but like large and very interesting to Russia, for instance, like oil processing or potash or some other parts of our gas delivery systems like the domestic one. But again, this is not the fastest growing sector. In terms of Russian interest in these companies, I think that under any scenario, under any authority, the most likely case of privatization by Russian companies is oil processing, because it is quite natural to sell these companies to those who keep the supply. And also what is quite important, I don't think that Russia will be will push Lukashenko to sell these companies right now, because I don't see that in this situation of the lack of legitimacy, it is quite difficult to make a deal, because in case if you are annexing territory like Crimea, you can do there what you want. But if you have a independent state and where Mr. Lukashenko will lose his power sooner or later, then any kind of this deal can be questioned by the next authority, because you made a deal with a non-legitimate. So with a person with lack of legitimacy. So, and I think it is important. So, it is quite hard to say that Russia have a very big room for maneuver with Mr. Lukashenko in power. I mean maneuver in terms of entering our economy as investors or as new owners.
Thank you. I'd like to now address a question to Dr. Aslan. How do you look upon the Russian integration measures that have been suggested?
Yeah, thank you very much, John, and thank you very much, colleagues, for this event, because I think this is quite important to understand how Russia can operate. And in order to understand it, I think that Dr. Burnikova put two very important numbers on the table. One is a net debt service next year, $3 billion, and you did mention current account deficit of $2.5 billion. So say in 1 year, Belarus needs approximately $6 billion in international financing. Putin so far, in Sochi on the 14th of September, put $1.5 billion on the table, which is not enough. More money must come. And as we have discussed, all of us, this essentially has to come from the private sector. Ideally, this would be an IMF program, but the IMF is not ready to go for any program with Lukashenko. They haven't had anything since 2009. because Lukashenko refuses to do the elementary things, stop subsidies to state enterprises and deregulate certain prices. So this is out of a question. And then US Ambassador Schubel indirectly pointed out can't provide money because it has to go to the regime, and the regime is not acceptable or even recognized. So then, as Dr. Inozemtsev pointed out, it's only the private sector. But I would elaborate a bit more what the private sector amounts to. And I think that a good parallel here is Armenia, because Armenia is completely controlled by Russian companies, primarily state companies. And it's interesting how that happened. To begin with, it was by and large debt equity swaps. Debt equity swaps is the worst way of doing business most of the time, because it means that you often sell an enterprise for 1/4 of or so of a real price, and you do it not for cash, but in order to get rid of the debt that you have run up. And the people who did the debt equity swap, they were not state companies. State companies came in and bought the Armenian companies later on from some Russian businessmen. And we see, I would emphasize 3 big Russian businessmen here who are really operating. Dr. Chubrik mentioned oil refinery and fertilizers. These are 4 companies that are relevant. 4 companies account for 2/3 of Belarus export to the West. It's most of all Belarus Kali that produces 1/5 of all potash in the world. And the obvious candidate on the Russian side there is Ural Kali, which is controlled by Dmitry Mazepin, who happens to be born Belarusian, grew up in Minsk, and he's now a chairman of Russia-Belarus Business Council. So this is the front man. And just in case, he is also dominant owner of Uralchem, which wants to buy Grodno Azot, the big nitrate fertilizer in Belarus. And then we have, as Dr. Chubrik mentioned, these 2 big refineries. Nafta is already mentioned, as Dr. Inozemtsev wrote in his excellent article for us in early September, to 42.5% by Slavneft, which is a Russian state company, previously owned by Mikhail Gutseriev, who is another point man for Belarus. And Gutseriev also seems to have his eyes on the other big refinery in Belarus, Moser, through his private company, Safmar. Probably all of it will in the end up with state-owned Rosneft. And how will it be financed? Normally, as Dr. Inozemtsev also points out, this is being financed by state-owned Sberbank, the biggest state bank in Russia, with the big loans. And German Gref, who's very close to Putin, is the CEO of Sberbank. So what I see here is that these 2 Russian businessmen, Dmitry Mazepin and Mikhail Gutseriev, can instigate taking over 4 companies that would account for 2/3, today account for 2/3 of the Belarus export to the West. And this would not be a good investment strategy. In Sochi, Putin also mentioned that there are now 2,500 firms in Belarus with Russian capital. Many of these are small and medium-sized enterprises because many Russians like doing business in Belarus because the business environment is much better than in Russia. So they have, these have emigrated individually. So there is also a substantial private sector, but that does not bring about big capital. The big capital that Belarus needs for its balance of payment would come from essentially these four companies, if it's not straightforward loans from the big Russian state banks, Sberbank and VTB, as could also be the question. So I see this as a big dilemma.
Yeah, Anders, thank you. That was magisterial. All right. Mr. Inozemtsev, if you have any comments on Andrew's view about this might be the likely source of Russian money coming into Belarus.
Look, I agree. I especially didn't mention my article I wrote for Atlantic Council website 2 months ago. But my feeling is that the Russian private investment, huge private investment, which can come to Belarus, for example, which is interested, the investors who are interested in huge enterprises like oil processing companies and or Belarus Kali or some other fertilizer producers, they definitely are backed by Sberbank or Sber, which is now called, as Anders mentioned, because I would say this is a very huge and very complicated connection between business and political interests, because Mr. Gref, who is the CEO of Sberbank and who is very, now engaged, heavily engaged in some political, undertakings in Russia, for example, he is acquiring one after another new Russian media outlets, creating a new potential media empire, which may serve the current government and Mr. Mishustin. So Mr. Gref, I would say, is one of the most important and influential backers of Lukashenko in Moscow. His Belarusian-based bank is, I would say, the fourth biggest in Belarus, or the fifth biggest. But nevertheless, I would say that Russian private business, if it comes to a big investment, it definitely behaves on requests of Russian state-owned enterprises and banks and financial structures. And Anders is absolutely right, saying that in all these cases, it might be some kind of debt for equity swaps. And I absolutely agree that this is a worst possible case scenario for privatization of Belarusian industry, because in this case, Lukashenko or whatever can be on his place, if someone will be installed from Moscow other than Lukashenko, all these people can actually exchange Belarusian debt, which I would say is not so huge. Yes, I understand that it should be around $5 billion should be found next year, and around $3 billion should be covered in repayments next year. But definitely, even the state-owned enterprise in Belarus, they could be valued much more. And for example, if they are not sold to the Russian investors, or I would say even not sold, but surrendered to the Russian investors, some kind of investment fund can be created based on their assets, and this fund can be used for, as a guarantee or collateral or whatsoever for inviting private Western investors, for example, or investors from all over the world. And this can be quite instrumental in repaying the debts, because I would once again repeat, they are not so astronomically high. In the case of Belarus, they can be repaid, and the Belarusian economy seems to be very ineffective. First of all, because it is mismanaged by the Lukashenko people, who are responsible for in charge for these enterprises. And I would say that the costs can be cut significantly, the effectiveness can be raised significantly if these enterprises are managed by professional Western or even Russian or Western, doesn't matter, managers who are interested in serving Belarus, but not Mr. Lukashenko himself. So my point is that I do not see the situation in Belarusian economy as critical, but it definitely needs a lot of work to be done. There is a lot of work to be done for making it more efficient. That's my point of view. And Russia will never provide such kind of efforts because it wants Belarus, once again, not Lukashenko, Belarus, to be a part of the Russian-backed economic system, to be a loyal element of Russian integration experiments, and in the end to be politically loyal to Russia. So therefore, I'm excluding any kind of potential benefits of expanding Russian economic interests in Belarus.
Okay. It also seemed from what you said that Russian businessmen or businesswomen who are truly interested in making a profit as opposed to simply doing a favor for the Kremlin would therefore not find Belarus attractive for investment.
Look, Mr. Olson said that the business environment in Belarus is much better than Russia. Maybe, but from my point of view, the Russian private investors, they are, they're full of business uncertainty either in Russia or in Belarus. So if they would like to diversify their investment, I doubt that they will choose Belarus instead of Russia. Yeah, maybe they will definitely go to some other destinations. But what I would like to say, as Anders mentioned, Mr. Mazepin or Mr. Gutseriev and some other people, the problem is that Mr. Gref is not only behind them. All these companies are heavily indebted inside Russia. They actually are semi-bankrupt or technically bankrupt because their debts are 6-7 times their revenues. So, and most of these debts are controlled by the Sberbank, as was mentioned before. So therefore, it's they might be not interested in Belarusian acquisitions, but nevertheless, they might be very easily forced to go this way and to ensure Russian economic interest there.
Dr. Chubrik and Dr. Barnukov, I don't mean to ignore our Belarusian colleagues. Do you see Russia as a source of capital for Belarus?
Well, again, I here can totally agree with what Dr. Schubel said, that at some point, so now with Lukashenko staying in power, I don't think that any country can be considered as a source for capital for Belarus, because our, well, debt markets are closed for us. I mean, international debt markets. Russia, or Anders said that Mr. Putin put on the table $1.5 billion, but in fact, they put only $0.5 billion, and all of this tranche was spent to pay back our debt for gas to Gazprom. So it was just money from Russian budget to Gazprom. Well, the uncertainty, I mean, political risks are very high. So they are.
Oh, but I'm not sure if we've got them.
Well, let me step in.
Please, yes.
Right. Just continuing Mr. Chubrik's thoughts. So the political risks issue is big because just recently we had Belgazprom Bank owned by Gazprom. It was basically expropriated from the owner, and we don't see any consequences or for Lukashenko for doing that. And the bank is not something that you just return after some time, because right now the deposits are gone. The bank is basically drawn out. It's not worth as much as it was before. So I think this is a big problem. So Russian investment would not flow in huge numbers unless, again, the political situation changes. If it changes, then of course Russia would be the number one candidate to invest because we have economic ties, because they understand our culture, our business climate, etc. But then there is also the issue that indeed we do not know the value of state-owned enterprises, and they might be undervalued, as Dr. Inozemtsev said, but they also might be overvalued because they operate in in a lot of regulatory preferences. And if they are forced to go to open markets, who knows how profitable they will be. Thank you.
Thank you. We have some audience questions. Oh, Andrews, go ahead. I didn't see your hand, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. These are very useful comments. I just wanted to add a few things to what has been said. First of all, investment, if it's private in Belarus today, can only come to Russia. No Western investor would go into Belarus today because the risks are too high. And an additional thing, a Russian investor of size, which Dr. Inozemtsev pointed out rightly, would only go in with state support or rather with state pressure. And it's interesting with Mazepin. I checked, he had in 2015, according to Forbes, a wealth of $1.3 billion. Now he controls more enterprises, but is no longer on the Forbes list of billionaires. He has dropped off. So I think that was the point you made, that they are heavily indebted is very relevant. And of course, Kutseyev Bank, one of the 5 biggest private banks, Bin Bank, collapsed in bankruptcy in 2017. So I think this is a very good point, that they have massive loans to Sberbank and therefore highly dependent on the state. But we're also seeing that the Kremlin sort of appoints people. As I emphasized that Mazepin is a chairman of the Russia-Belarus Business Council. He's, so to say, the official business representative to Belarus, and is also quite famous as a corporate raider in Russia. He's also chairman of the Russia-Africa Business Council. So what this means is that you get, so to say, the worst of the Russian business, where people are very much involved in dirty business in Russia and abroad, coming to Belarus because they are the most liable people to the Kremlin. So what we really have is 2 kinds of business: Western European business with some rule of law, and Kremlin business which would aggravate the business environment in Belarus. So this is an additional concern. And of course, Dr. Chubrik is right, nobody will put up money for Belarus today, apart from Russia, and then under highly conditional forms. What is the alternative? Massive austerity, which would be very severe indeed. And of course, you are all right to say that the debt is not big, but the debt is overwhelming if nobody is prepared to roll it over. Thank you.
It looks like, thank you, Andres. Looks like Dr. Chubrik is back with us. Dr. Chubrik, you were cut off mid-sentence. I don't know if you want to complete your thought or just offer any comment at this point.
Well, I think colleagues absolutely answered and completed my thoughts, and please give the floor to the question.
Okay, that's good. All right, I'm going to take some questions from the audience. I have a question from Pyotr Grishin, and his question is to Katerina Alexander. It goes like this. A couple of weeks ago, Alice Aleknovich, an advisor to Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, voiced an idea that Belarus, in case of the transition of power happens, should seek external debt restructuring. Do you think this is a good idea and necessary?
Well, let me try. I think he chose wrong words, basically, because he meant that we will have probably to go and negotiate, first of all, with Russia, which holds 50% of our debt, about some new loans, probably. But then I'm sure that once we get back we get access back to the international financial organizations, the first thing we should seek out is IMF loan, which we would be able to do because the new government would probably launch reforms. So with this, I don't see that there would be a huge necessity to restructure any loans, but of course that would depend on say how the pandemic goes, because how our trade, external trade, would evolve is also very important.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Chubich, you want to jump in here?
Yep. Belarusian representatives love to say about the necessity to restructure debt. You may remember, like a few years ago, Mr. Lukashenko mistook the title. So instead of refinancing, he told restructuring and dropped our securities quite substantially. Like this year, well, probably Mr. Krutoy, deputy head of the presidential administration, said some similar stuff. But in fact, I should say that the risks are not, well, in the situation when Lukashenko leaves, okay, there are risks, but in fact, there are more opportunities than risks. As Katerina mentioned, it will at least unlock the international financial institutions' money and interest towards Belarus, and I think it can be quite quick negotiations. But in case if Mr. Lukashenko stays, next year we have very high likelihood of sovereign default. At least that's my personal view, because, well, really, the lack of liquidity is quite hard to estimate completely due to, quite a low degree of transparency of of finance of state-owned enterprises. Many of their loans, like big share of their loans, are guaranteed by the state, and also our banks have debt, and they have special covenants. And in case if these covenants will start to be like violated, then money can be recalled by investors, and it may create additional pressure. So on the budget, on our sovereign credit rankings, on our bank's assets, and also in addition to this, we have plenty of quite stupid political decisions and rumors about further stupid political decisions that may fasten a banking crisis. So we have sort of not one or two black swans, but like the full lake of black swans, of black swans that go together. And next year, end of the first quarter, well, the risks are very high. So again, Russia may prefer to step in at some point, but here again, uncertainty is quite low. So I should say that the risks are not in the change of the authority, and personally, I can see that Ms. Tikhanovskaya will replace Mr. Lukashenko.
Okay, thank you. We have an anonymous question.
In exile. So yeah.
All right, thank you. We have a question anonymously from the audience. What Belarusian, we've partly gone over this, but I'll put it up again. What Belarusian industries or sectors of the economy is Russia most interested in controlling, and why? Anders, you want to take a shot at that?
Sorry. Yeah, I think that's what has already been made. I mean, it's the two big refineries and the two big fertilizer companies, Uralkali, Grodno Azot, Naftan, and Mosir refineries. And in one way or the other, refineries would probably end up with Rosneft, probably with Gutseriev as a middleman. Before that, he would do the actual business, and the fertilizers, that would be Mazepin. So there are very few operators who are involved, and these two men seem to be authorized by Russia. And it would be interesting to hear Vladislav's point of view, if I've got that right or not. And this would be very tough. But let me also say, what is the alternative if this doesn't happen? We saw it pretty much in 2011. It was a very similar situation. Belarus was running out of reserves. What happened? The Belarusian ruble plummets. So far, it has fallen 20% this year. As pointed out by our Belarusian colleagues, it's likely to fall now more because there is a minor bank run already. It can get much worse. And then you can easily get a depreciation that is very big. Then you get high inflation. In 2011, it went up to 109%. And right now, inflation is only 5%. But if there's a big depreciation, it will fall. And so Belarus is really in a tough place, as Sasha Chubrik pointed out, that there is also a possibility that Russia, or specific Russian subjects, pull loans. Sberbank is famous for doing that within Russia, putting companies into bankruptcy and then taking over them because a liquidity crisis becomes a solidity crisis, and then they are cooked. So I think that this could easily happen to Belarus, and we saw in 2011. At the time, I did not think that Putin would bail out Belarus, and then in the end he did, but at conditions that gave him, for example, the whole Gazprom pipeline system and half of naphtha oil refinery. Now it's time to take more. So I think that this will be instigated from the Kremlin, as Vladislav Inozemtsov pointed out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andres. Dr. Inozemtsov, do you have a comment on this?
No, I also will not. Everything, I agree with Anders, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to ignore Ambassador Schäuble. We've got a question from Denis Dubrovin. He asked, do you think that the EU sanctions against Lukashenka and 14 other top officials, which has just been announced, would push Belarus towards the EU and not towards Russia? In other words, what do you think is the political impact of your sanctions?
Well, I think the question is not whether Belarus turns to the one or the other side. As I said in the beginning, we are not in a geopolitical competition here. We want to help Belarus to become to stay an independent country and in which the rule of law is reigning and democracy is reigning. This is what we want in our neighborhood. Sanctions are, of course, never a good means, but it's the only means that or the main means that we have to express our dissatisfaction with what has happened in Belarus, in particular since the 9th of August. We do not have the grand illusion that there will be great changes in the leadership through that, but we hope, of course, that Mr. Lukashenko and the authorities come to reason to stop violence and all of this. So this is what our hope is. But in the first place, sanctions are an expression of dissatisfaction by the European Union or by anybody else for that matter, that something doesn't go the right way as we had hoped it for. It hinders, by the way, also economic development, by the way. If the rule of law is not properly applied in a country, and we can say that the rule of law has been violated on so many occasions, then obviously the economic development will also stagnate, because who will come to Belarus, as some of the speakers also have already mentioned. So the question, once again, is not in which direction the country will develop. We hope that our sanctions contribute, that the authorities come to reason and stop applying violence and stop falsifying elections, allow for new elections, and release all political prisoners.
Thank you. We've got a question from Tony van der Tocht, which I think is for our two Belarusian participants. The question is this: how far do you expect economic and or financial integration in the context of the Union State Treaty between Belarus and the Russian Federation to go in the near future? Katerina?
I think And this is very difficult to judge because all the talks about integration are like top secret and we don't know much about what's going on. But I believe that the issue of Lukashenko's legitimacy is big here. Because anything really big on economic integration, which would need to be signed by him, would be then questioned. And I think our Russian counterparts understand that very well. That's why they're not pressuring much with the integration right now, and they prefer to talk about something more tangible and which doesn't require Lukashenko's signature, like redirecting our trade from Lithuanian ports to Russian ports. Right. So I also don't see the big Russian interest in integration. From economic point of view, so they rather see economic integration as a political tool than otherwise. So I don't expect any big economic integration decisions anytime soon.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Chubrik, do you want to jump in here? Or?
Well, I agree with Katya, and also I should say that this project of union state of Belarus and Russia is, I can't see that it will survive after all. So the project of Eurasian Economic Union is much more interesting because it is about like real economic integration. But union state, you should have to complete this project or to at least move forward in terms of this project. You may have serious popular support here, but population, very tiny share of population, like less than 10% is for is for real union of these two countries, so in fact of incorporation of Belarus by Russia. And now we see for the last 2 years, we see the great increase of the share of population that is for independence, like absolute independence of Belarus from Russia, just for some normal integration as with the rest of the world. I should say 2/3 of population is for this option, at least according to the most recent polls. So in this sense, I can see that this project is really viable.
Okay, thank you. And Vladislav, you want to jump in here as well?
Yes, I absolutely agree with the bad fate of this project, because actually the integration in the framework of the Union state is too ambitious, even for Belarus and Russia. Of course, they are very closely connected countries, but nevertheless, I would say no one will, give up his sovereignty, like in Belarus, for example, in introducing the single currency. And of course, in Russia, no one will even think about, abandoning ruble and producing something like, euro or whatsoever, a new currency for two countries. So therefore, I would say that it was a very good idea, and I agree with Mr. Chubrik, before Eurasian Economic Union emerged, because all the benefits Belarus can get from the Union state, economic benefits, they can be actually derived from Eurasian Union. And as it comes to political integration, it was, very popular in early 2000s when the union was created. But now I would say neither Belarus nor Russia doesn't really want the political integration, because actually, for me, the most interesting question was and still is why it is believed that Putin wants to incorporate Belarus inside Russia. I never thought it was the case, because actually we all saw how active the Belarusian population is politically, and how maybe not pro-European, but actually pro-democratic it is. And everything what happened after the election proves this. And if, for example, one imagine that Belarus is a part of Russia, so what for Mr. Putin needs this 8-9 million of quite, maybe not in majority, but in a huge part European-oriented, European-educated people with much different ambitions and much different feelings That's the majority of the Russians. So this is actually an explosive inside the concept of the Russian Federation, which is actually not so much strong these days. So from my point of view, if I were Mr. Putin, I never dreamed about incorporating Belarus inside Russia politically. It's not a Donbass. It's much more European, open society, much more inclined for private enterprise, much less with much less atavistic feelings than Russia. So therefore, I don't think everybody in Moscow dreams now about full political integration.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Anna Davidson at the University of Oxford. It goes like this. Belarus's new nuclear power plant has just produced the first unit of electricity to the grid. And this plant is partly funded by the Russian state loan of $10 billion, with an interest rate fixed at 3.3%. Belarus is currently nearly 100% dependent on Russian imports for energy supply, but the reactor will bring this dependency down. Do any of the panelists have thoughts on the integratory elements of this relationship between Russia and Belarus, meaning the energy relationship and the impact of this new reactor?
Yeah, dear Ambassador, I just tried to answer this in written form, but I would add a little bit because my point was that this project arose around 10 or 15 years ago when Rosatom, the Russian state-owned atomic energy company, was very interested in overseas and foreign expansion. So it was like, you know, a must to build new Russian nuclear power station elsewhere, except of Russia. So this was, and the Russian government was very closely connected with this company because Mr. Kirienko was in charge of it. He was the CEO. So therefore, my thought is that the Russians, that the company was actually the initiator of the scheme. The Russian government issued a state loan, and the loan was definitely much bigger than it was necessary to build the station. No one cared about where this energy will be shipped, how profitable it will be. This was actually absolutely not a question because it was about, maybe not about money laundering, but about, you know, using the state-owned funds and nothing else. And the last point I would say that Lukashenko claimed 2 weeks ago, that around $1.3 billion, which came from this Russian state loan for building this company, can be used to buy or to construct a new port facility near St. Petersburg, which can be managed by Belarusians, owned and managed by Belarusians, and used for selling the Belarusian potassium overseas. So it was not so much an economic project or an energy depending project. It was just a state-run enterprise which from which anybody involved benefits, personally, I would say.
Okay, Katerina Alexander, do you have any comments here?
Let me comment for that. For Belarus, that was about energy independence in a sense, because right now 60% of energy is produced from Russia-supplied gas. And that, of course, puts us in a huge dependence from one turn of the valve. And this was probably one of the reasons why this station was built in the first place.
Okay, well, I think that pretty much sums it up. I think our time is up. I'd like to thank Anders who conceived of this event. I'd like to thank our panelists, Dr. Chubrik, Dr. Baranukova, Dr. Inozemtsev, and Ambassador Schäuble, for a very interesting conversation. And we'll be pursuing this. We'll be watching what's happening in Belarus and, of course, Russia very closely in the months and years to come. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.